The prairie wind had a way of carrying whispers farther than they were meant to go. On that late autumn morning, when the sun rose pale and cold above the settlement, it carried with it the quiet shame of a woman who had already lost too much. The widow stood stiff and trembling on the rough wooden porch of her late husband's family home, her daughter pressed against her skates. The girl was small, perhaps no more than 9, her thin arms clutching her mother's waist as though she feared the ground itself might fall away beneath them. Both their eyes were wide, filled with dread and humiliation, while the hands of the in-laws moved with pitiless precision. The scissors gleamed in the light, cutting away long strands of hair that fell to the dusty ground like pieces of dignity being stripped and scattered by the breeze. No one in the gathered crowd spoke above a murmur. Some looked away, ashamed of what was being done, while others stared with quiet approval, believing this act of cruelty to be some twisted form of justice. The widow's late husband had left debts and grievances, and though she had no hand in them, his kin treated her as if she were the root of all their misfortunes. To them, she was a burden to be cast aside, an unwelcome mouth to feed, and the girl beside her nothing but another weight dragging down their fragile livelihood. The mother's name was not called, not even whispered, as though her identity no longer mattered. She was simply the widow, a shadow of a man they still cursed, and now they cut her hair to mark her as less than whole, less than worthy. The daughter, too, flinched when the rough hand of her aunt gripped her shoulder, forcing her to bow her head so the scissors could shear through the chestnut locks that had once been her pride. The child's tears came hot and fast, but no one stepped forward to wipe them away. Across the street, leaning against the rail outside the livery, a man watched with eyes as steady as a winter storm. He was not family, nor had he been invited into their quarrels, but his jaw tightened with every cruel snip of the blade. His name carried little weight in the settlement, though most knew him as a rancher from the far reaches of the open land. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face that spoke of long days under sun and rain alike, he was a figure people often nodded but rarely engaged. He preferred solitude, his cattle, and the endless horizon. Yet now, as the widow and her daughter stood humiliated before their kin, something stirred in him that refused to stay silent. The widow's breath trembled. She had thought the worst had already passed. The burial of her husband, the long nights of hunger, the endless struggle to keep her child clothed and fed. But this? To stand before neighbors and kin while her very hair was stolen as a sign of disgrace. It broke something in her that had remained stubbornly unbroken through grief and hardship. Her hand found her daughter's, squeezing it tightly, but she dared not resist. Resistance would only mean woes, and she had endured enough blows of fate to know when fighting back brought ruin. The scissors closed with a final snap, leaving the girl's hair uneven and ragged. The aunt tossed the fallen locks into the date as though discarding scraps of cloth. A brother-in-law, stout and red-faced, stepped forward to announce loudly enough for those on the street to hear that the widow and her child were no longer welcome beneath the roof of his kin. They were to take what little they had and leave, find their way elsewhere, for they were no longer part of this family. Murmurs rose in the crowd, some murmurs of pity, others of indifference, but none offered a hand. The widow swallowed hard, trying to keep her composure, but her daughter clung to her skirts and sobbed openly. The shame of it all wrapped around them like chains. She could feel eyes on her, judging, pitying, condemning, and she wanted nothing more than to vanish into the earth. Yet she remained upright, proud even in her humiliation, because she had a child to shield, and if she crumbled now, there would be nothing left to give her daughter hope. The rancher pushed off the rail. His boots struck the ground with deliberate weight, each step carrying him closer until his shadow stretched across the dusty ground to touch the widow's feet. The crowd shifted uneasily. He was not kin, not involved, yet he walked with the certainty of one who had already made up his mind. He stopped in front of the widow, his presence towering over the smaller figures of her tormentors, and for a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at the shorn hair at their feet, at the trembling child, at the pale, proud face of the woman who refused to bow her head despite everything. Then his voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "You're coming with me." The words were not shouted. They were spoken low, steady, with a weight that left no room for doubt. His gaze never shifted from the widow's, and for the first time since the scissors had begun their cruel work, she felt something stronger than shame pressing against her chest. She felt confusion, disbelief, and a flicker of something she had not known in years, the possibility of rescue. Her brother-in-law stepped forward, face twisted with indignation. "This ain't your concern, rancher." She's ours to deal with, and she'll leave when we say so." The rancher's eyes narrowed. "You had your say. I've had mine." A tense silence followed. The crowd leaned in, sensing the air grow heavier. The widow looked between them, her heart pounding. She did not know this man beyond a passing glance at the general store, a nod exchanged on the street. He was a stranger to her life, yet he stood now as though the outcome of this moment mattered more to him than the whispers of kinship or town gossip. Her daughter's small hand tugged at her skirt, eyes wide with both fear and hope, and the widow realized that the child was looking not at her but at the rancher. "You got no right." The aunt spat, arms crossed. "She's got nothing. She can't feed herself, let alone that girl. Best she's sent on her way. You can't take in every stray that wanders by." The rancher's jaw tightened. "She's not a stray. She's a woman left standing when the world tried to break her. And the girl is hers. That's all the right I need." Gasps rose from the crowd, scandalized by the audacity, yet no one stepped forward to challenge him directly. The widow's brother-in-law sputtered, his face reddening further, but the rancher shifted his weight, the subtle hint of a man who could back his words with force oppressed. His hand hovered near his belt where the worn leather of a revolver holster rested, and though he had not touched the weapon, the sight of it was enough to cool some of the heat in the air. The widow found her voice, though it came soft, almost a whisper. "Why? Why would you?" She stopped herself, unable to shape the rest of the question. The rancher's eyes softened just slightly. "Because no one else will." For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The widow's in-laws exchanged glances, uncertain whether to push further or let the matter drop. The child's hand tightened around her mother's, as if begging her to accept what was being offered. And the widow, though still trembling, realized that for the first time since her husband's death, someone had spoken not of her as a burden, but of her as someone worth saving. The brother-in-law cursed under his breath and waved a hand dismissively. "Fine. Take her, if you're so determined. Don't come running back when she drags you down." The rancher inclined his head slightly, not in thanks but in acknowledgment of the inevitable. He turned to the widow, extending a calloused hand. "Gather what you can. We ride before sundown." The widow hesitated. Her pride and fear wrestled within her, but her daughter tugged insistently, eyes shining with desperate hope. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, not the grip of a man offering pity, but of one offering strength. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring and gossiping, the rancher led the widow and her daughter away from the porch where their shame had been laid bare. The strands of hair still stirred in the wind, but the humiliation they carried no longer bound them. The widow glanced back once, seeing the house that had never felt like a home, and then she looked ahead at the open horizon. She did not know what awaited her there, nor why this man had chosen to intervene. But as the sun lowered toward the western hills, she felt the faint stirrings of something she had thought long buried. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. The rancher's voice came again, low but certain. "You're not alone anymore." And though the road ahead was uncertain, the widow tightened her grip on her daughter's hand and walked forward, away from the ashes of her shame and into the promise of something unknown. The wagon creaked beneath its weight as the rancher guided it away from the settlement, the fading light spilling long shadows across the land. Dust rose in spirals behind them, caught in the red glow of the setting sun. The widow sat stiffly on the bench, her daughter curled against her side, while the rancher's steady hands gripped the reins. Neither mother nor child spoke, still carrying the echo of humiliation that clung to them like smoke. The open land stretched endless and empty before them, beautiful yet merciless, a reminder that survival in these parts was never promised. The girl stirred and whispered, "Mama, where are we going?" Her voice was small, almost lost against the steady groan of the wheels. The widow smoothed the child's hair, uneven and jagged from the cruel scissors. She hesitated, glancing at the man beside her. "Somewhere else," she finally said. "Somewhere we can start again." The rancher's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, but his voice carried a steady weight. "We'll head west. There's pasture and water. Safer ground than this." The widow looked at him then, really looked, searching his face for the motive she had not yet grasped. He remained unreadable, carved from silence and endurance, but the firmness in his tone lent her a small comfort. He was not a man who spoke lightly. As the last of the daylight faded, the prairie changed its song. Crickets chirped, coyotes howled from the hills, and the wind carried the scent of distant rain. They pressed on until the moon rose pale and cold, before the rancher finally drew the wagon to a stop beside a copse of cottonwoods. He set about tending the horses while the widow coaxed her daughter into a blanket. The air was sharp, biting through worn clothes, and though fatigue dragged at her bones, the widow forced herself to stay upright. She had learned long ago that the world was unforgiving to those who let down their guard. The rancher returned, setting his rifle within reach before lowering himself against a log. His silence was not unkind, simply practice, like a man accustomed to solitude. The widow found herself listening to the crackle of leaves, the soft breaths of her sleeping child, and the quiet presence of the stranger who had altered the course of her life in a single sentence. She wanted to ask him why. Why her? Why now? But the words caught in her throat. Perhaps she feared the answer, or perhaps she feared he might not answer at all. Sleep did not come easily. The wilderness had a way of reminding the vulnerable how small they truly were. Every rustle of branches, every distant cry of an animal set her heart racing. Near midnight, a sound sharper than the rest split the air, a branch breaking, deliberate, close. She sat bolt upright, clutching her daughter close. The rancher was already awake, his hand on the rifle, eyes narrowed into the darkness. From the edge of the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, lean, silent. The moonlight revealed the lines of a man clothed in buckskin, his hair long and braided, his movements measured. He stopped just beyond the glow of the wagon's lantern, eyes catching the light with a predator's calm. The widow's breath caught. Her daughter stirred, whispering fearfully, "Mama." The rancher raised a rifle but did not fire. His voice was steady. "You've been following us." The stranger said nothing. He simply stood, studying them as though weighing their worth. His presence radiated both danger and restraint. The widow felt her skin prickle, torn between fear and the inexplicable sense that this figure was not here to harm them. Moments stretched toward his wire before the stranger slowly raised his hand. In it, he held something small, a strip of cloth snagged on a thorn. He tossed it to the ground between them. The rancher glanced down and recognized it immediately, a remnant from the widow's bundle, lost along the trail. The man had tracked them with ease, following signs none of them had noticed. "You found us," the rancher said quietly. The stranger gave a single nod. Still, he offered no name. With the ease of a man unbothered by threat, he crouched near the fire, uninvited, and pulled a piece of dried meat from his pouch. He ate slowly, eyes never leaving them. The widow's daughter whispered, "Is he going to stay?" The widow pulled her close, unsure of the answer. The rancher lowered his rifle, though it remained close at hand. Seems as already decided. Through the long hours until dawn, the stranger neither spoke nor slept. He kept watch with a vigilance that unsettled the widow but reassured her all the same. When morning came, he vanished into the trees without a word, leaving behind only faint tracks in the soil. The days that followed tested them all. The prairie grew harsher with each mile, storms rolling across the horizon, sudden downpours that turned the earth to mud, winds that cut through their clothes like knives. The wagon wheel cracked against a hidden stone, forcing the rancher to spend hours repairing it beneath the hot sun. Water grew scarce, and hunger gnawed at their bellies. The widow did what she could, rationing what little they had, but she felt despair creeping at the edges of her resolve. It was during one such storm, when the wind howled like a living thing and rain lashed against them, that the stranger returned. He appeared from the curtain of rain with a deer slung across his shoulders, dropping it by the fire as though he had never left. The widow's daughter gasped in awe, her hunger overtaking her fear. The widow herself could not mask her relief. The rancher met the man's gaze. "You'll stay. Then." The stranger's only answer was to draw his knife and begin the work of carving. They ate that night, their first real meal in days. The girl, cheeks smeared with grease, smiled for the first time since their departure from the settlement. The widow, watching her daughter's laughter return, felt something loosen in her chest. When she glanced at the stranger, she caught him watching the girl with an expression that flickered between sternness and quiet sorrow. Trust came slowly. The widow remained cautious, but she could not deny the relief his presence brought. He found water where there seemed none, set snares that caught rabbits, and kept predators at bay with the ease of one born to the land. The rancher, though wary, began to acknowledge him with brief nods, the unspoken language of men who recognize one another's competence. One evening, after they had fought off a pack of wolves that circled too close, the widow found herself sitting across the fire from him. Her daughter slept soundly beside her, worn from the ordeal. The rancher had gone to tend the horses. She studied the stranger, his face lined by firelight. "You've saved us more than once," she said softly. "Why?" His eyes lifted, dark and unreadable. For a long moment, she thought he might ignore her. But then he spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "Because you keep walking, even when the world tries to stop you." It was the first full sentence she had heard from him. The words sank deep, warming something in her that had long been cold. She nodded, unable to reply. The bond grew in small, wordless gestures. The widow's daughter, once afraid, began offering him pieces of bread or fruit when they had it. He accepted with a nod, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. The widow found herself watching him wait, noting the patience in his movements, the respect he showed the land. The rancher spoke more to him now as well, short exchanges about trail signs, weather shifts, dangers ahead. They did not need many words. Understanding grew in the silences. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One afternoon, from the crest of a ridge, the rancher spotted riders in the distance. Too far to identify, but too many to be friendly. He returned to the camp with grim certainty etched in his face. "They are following," he said. The widow felt her stomach knot. "Who?" "Could be bandits. Could be your kin. Either way, they won't mean us well." The stranger listened without expression, then began preparing quietly, checking his bow, adjusting the knife at his side. The message was clear. Danger was coming, and they would need to face it together. That night, the widow lay awake, her daughter's breast steady against her shoulder, while the two men kept watch. She stared at the stars scattered like cold fire across the sky and felt the weight of everything pressing down on her: grief, fear, uncertainty. Yet beneath it all, there was something else too, fragile but undeniable. She was not alone. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of a strength that was not borrowed but shared. The riders would come. The wilderness would test them further. But for now, in the fragile cocoon of firelight and shared silence, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The morning broke heavy with silence, the kind that comes before trouble. The widow woke with a start, her daughter still curled against her side, while the embers of the fire smoldered low. The rancher stood at the edge of camp, his eyes fixed on the horizon, every line of his frame taut with unease. The stranger was already gone, vanished into the brush as he often did, though she knew he was never far. She rose quietly, her body sore from the hard ground, and moved to stand beside the rancher. His jaw was set, his hand resting near the rifle slung at his side. "They are closer," he said, not looking at her. The widow followed his gaze. On the far ridge, small against the morning sky, the silhouettes of riders moved with purpose. The sight sent a chill down her spine. Her in-laws, perhaps, determined to drag her back to humiliation. Or worse, bandits, drawn by the weakness of a small party alone in the wild. Whichever it was, their intent was written in the steady advance. Her daughter stirred and yawned, rubbing her eyes, unaware of the shadow creeping upon them. The widow smoothed the girl's hair and forced a smile, but inside her chest a storm raged. She had run from shame, endured hunger, trusted strangers, and now the world sought to test her again. The rancher turned, his eyes meeting hers. "We can't outrun them. We'll have to stand." Her mouth went dry. She had never held a gun, never lifted her hands in violence. Yet the thought of losing her daughter to the cruelty of others burned through her fear. She nodded once, firm despite the terror knotting her stomach. By midday, the riders drew closer. Dust plumed behind them, the thunder of hooves carrying across the open land. The stranger returned as silently as he had left, his bow in hand, a quiver across his back. He gave a single nod, his gaze flicking from the riders to the child to the widow, and she understood. He would fight with them. The rancher moved quickly, guiding them to a defensible patch of land where the rocks rose jagged and uneven. The wagon was pulled against the stones to form a crude barricade. The widow helped as best she could, her hands trembling but steady enough to pass ammunition, to gather stones, to clear brush. Her daughter clung to her until the rancher crouched and spoke gently to the girl, promising her safety, promising that they would stand between her and danger. Something in his calm steadiness eased the child's fear, and she allowed her mother to lead her behind the wagon, tucked low where stray bullets might not reach. The riders arrived in a storm of dust and shouts, faces hardened by greed and spite, eyes sharp with hunger. Among them were men the widow recognized, her husband kin, their mouths twisted with bitterness, leading a handful of rough strangers who bore the look of hired hands. They dismounted with jeers, spreading out to encircle the barricade. "You thought you could run," the brother-in-law spat, his voice thick with contempt. "Thought you could shame us further by throwing yourself in with some drifter? You belong to us, woman. Always have." The widow's hands curled into fists. She wanted to scream that she had never belonged to him, that she was not theirs to use and discard. But the words caught in her throat, burning hot. The rancher stepped forward, rifle in hand, his stance unshaken. "She belongs to no one but herself, and you'll not lay a hand on her or the child." Laughter rose from the band. The leader sneered, gesturing toward the rancher. "You'll die for her, then? A woman who's nothing but trouble? Not worth the dote she stands on." The rancher's reply was simple, final, "Worth more than any of you." The silence that followed broke with the crack of a rifle. Splinters flew from the wagon as bullets struck, and chaos erupted. The widow pulled her daughter close, shielding her small frame as gunfire roared across the rocks. The rancher returned fire with sharp precision, each shot purposeful, forcing the riders to take cover. The stranger moved like a ghost, arrows loose with deadly accuracy, each finding its mark before the enemy even realized he had struck. The widow's heart pounded. Fear threatened to crush her. Yet amidst the storm she saw the rancher stumble, a bullet grazing his shoulder. He gritted his teeth, pressing on, but blood darkened his shirt. She felt a surge of helplessness until her eyes fell on the rifle lying beside her. Her hands shook as she reached for it. She remembered her husband's lessons long ago, before he died, when he had tried to teach her how to hold steady, how to breathe. She had never fired in earnest. But now, with her daughter's life on the line, she found herself standing. She rose from cover, bracing the rifle against her shoulder. The enemy's laughter rang in her ears, mocking, dismissing her as weak. She took aim, breath held, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, clumsy but true. One of the riders staggered and fell. The jeers cut short. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. The rancher looked up, blooded but fierce, and met her gaze. Pride flickered in his eyes. She had crossed the line between helplessness and resolve, and there would be no turning back. The battle raged on. Smoke filled the air, the acrid stench of gunpowder mingling with dust and sweat. The stranger fought with quiet ferocity, moving through the chaos like a force of nature. But numbers pressed against them, relentless. The rancher staggered again, this time falling to one knee. The widow's cry caught in her throat, but she refused to falter. She reloaded clumsily, hands slick with sweat, and fired again. The enemy pressed closer, circling, shouting threats. One of the in-laws lunged toward the wagon, snarling, and in that desperate moment the widow swung the rifle like a club, striking him hard enough to drop him to the ground. Her breath came ragged, her body trembling, but inside she felt something fierce ignite. She was no longer the broken figure shorn of pride on a porch. She was fighting for her life, for her child, and for the dignity that had been stolen from her. Then came the breaking point. The stranger, having felled more than any man should, took a bullet to the side. He staggered, blood spilling, yet he pressed on long enough to loose one final arrow that felled the band's leader. The others faltered, their resolve shattering without him. Some fled, scrambling for their horses. Others stumbled back, wounded and defeated. The brother-in-law cursed and spat, retreating with the survivors, his threat lingering in the dust. The field grew quiet, save for the labored breaths of the three who remained. Smoke drifted on the breeze, carrying the scent of blood and battle. The widow lowered the rifle slowly, her arms aching. The rancher leaned heavily against the rocks, his wound bleeding but not fatal. He looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite the pain. "You stood," he said hoarsely. "You fought." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "I had to. For her. For all of us." The stranger sank to the ground, his face pale, the arrow quiver empty. The widow moved to his side, pressing cloth against his wound. But he shook his head. His gaze found Hayes, and for the first time his expression softened completely. "You walk stronger now," he whispered, his voice faint. "The world cannot take that from you." Her throat tightened. She wanted to beg him to hold on, to stay, but she saw the truth in his eyes. He had given what he could, and his path would not stretch farther. The rancher lowered his head in respect, silent as the stranger's breath slowed and stilled. The widow sat back, tears streaking her face, the girl clinging to her side. They had lost him, this enigmatic ally who had walked with them through the wild, but his gift remained: strength, trust, resilience. The rancher pressed a hand against his wound, grimacing, but his voice was steady. "We'll bury him here. Let him rest in the land he respected." Together they worked through the fading light. The widow's hands blistered, the child gathering stones with quiet determination. They laid him to rest beneath a small rise, marked only by the rocks they piled, a simple tribute to a man who had asked for nothing but had given everything. The widow whispered a prayer, her words carried away by the wind, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt not despair but gratitude. When the work was done, they sat together in silence, the fire casting long shadows. The girl leaned against the rancher's uninjured arm, trusting him with the innocence of a child who had seen both cruelty and mercy. The widow looked at the man beside her, at the strength in his silence, the steadiness in his gaze. "You saved us," she said softly. His reply came without hesitation. "No, we saved each other." The words lingered, heavy and true. She realized then that she was no longer a woman stripped of dignity, nor merely a widow surviving in the margins. She was something more, forged in fire and loss, tempered by trust and courage. As dawn broke the next morning, painting the sky in gold and crimson, they prepared to move on. The world ahead remained uncertain, filled with danger and hardship, but as the wagon creaked forward, the widow no longer looked back. She held her daughter's hand tightly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The rancher rode beside them, his wound bandaged, his voice quiet but resolute. "No matter what comes, you're not alone anymore." The widow breathed deeply, the weight on her chest lighter than it had been in years. The road stretched endless before them, but within her, strength stirred like the rising sun. And so they moved forward, bound not by pity or shame, but by the fragile, unbreakable bond of survival, trust, and a promise of something better.